Hi everyone, it's Tom, your English instructor again. This video is about how to organize the body paragraphs of your literature paper. If you have not already looked at the Monty Python video that I linked in the folder that this is sitting in, please do that first. Then read the student paragraph that tries to analyze that video clip, and then we will talk about it a little bit. Okay? So once you've done all those things, come back here and let's get started. Okay, now that you've looked at the Monty Python video and you've read the student paragraph, let's get started talking about summarizing and analyzing in a literature paper. So one of the chief dangers of a literature or a literary analysis is that students tend to summarize the works that they are talking about rather than analyze them. And the chief problem or the chief trap they fall into is they do something that seems very natural. They organize their paper and their paragraphs in chronological order. This makes perfect sense. Stories are told in chronological order. Poems are often written in chronological order, so the natural inclination for you would be to summarize them in chronological order. This is a mistake, and let me show you why I think that is the case. So this is the paragraph that the student wrote trying to analyze the video clip of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The scene where the Black Knight fights King Arthur and loses all his limbs. Now, the idea the student's trying to convey is that this is a silly scene. It's not really motivated as any kind of action scene, but it's trying to convey some kind of satire. Exactly what, I'm not sure, but that's the point of the paragraph so far. But the student, as I said, makes a common mistake here and organizes the paragraph in a chronological way. We even open with an identifying sentence that sort of names the place in the movie here rather than starting with the claim or the argument the student is trying to make. What I mean by this is he just starts off by saying, as the scene begins, King Arthur is riding through the forest. In some ways, this is an effective designation because it tells us what scene we're talking about. But really, all it does is sort of set us up to just retell the plot or the story. In other words, we don't know why we're talking about this scene. We don't know what argument the author of the student paper is trying to advance. It seems like a natural thing to do to begin by talking about the place in the movie that we want to discuss, but really what happens is we just continue to summarize rather than breaking down or advancing arguments. So the next sentence, he comes upon two knights who are fighting. Again, summary, all right? Arthur watches the two knights do battle with different weapons. It sometimes seems unclear how these two knights have the weapons they use. We are still summarizing. We're about 3 or 4 sentences in. Eventually, the Black Knight kills the Green Knight by throwing a very large sword in the Green Knight's visor. Once again, we're all the way to this point, and we haven't analyzed or done anything than retold the film. Now, film analysis, literature analysis is more or less the same in this regard. You do not need to retell this much of the plot to your reader. Assume that your reader has seen or read the artifact that you are analyzing. You're trying to teach the reader something about it. You're not trying to retell or resituate the story. You may sometimes need a sentence at the most to remind the reader of an event or a particular item, but you don't need to retell the narrative in this way, right? I think why students fall into this trap is they bring up a number of details that might seem significant in these summaries, at least significant to them. For example, if you look at or think about, sometimes it seems unclear how these two knights have the weapons they use. Eventually, the Black Knight kills the Green Knight by throwing a very large sword in the knight's visor. There are reasons for bringing up these details, reasons the student might have for sort of focusing his attention on these particular things. In other words, in the student's mind, these are very telling details, and therefore, because the student's brought them up, he thinks that he is doing analysis, not summary. The problem is he is not conveying to us, the reader, what the significance of these details are. The reason he hasn't done this is he's just at this point retelling the story. And the reason he's retelling the story is he started in chronological order and he's just going through a kind of list of things he noticed, right? That's not what analysis is. Analysis needs a claim and then evidence for that claim. And so far, we don't have any argument or analysis of what's happening in the scene. Now, it's a little better here. This looks very silly and seems completely unrealistic. But again, this is a kind of vague statement. We don't know what exactly the reason for this is. We don't have an answer to the so what question. So we don't know what's going on. From there, the scene becomes more and more unrealistic. Next, King Arthur has to fight the Black Knight, and once again, we're back into summary. The fight does not seem to be about anything in particular. The Black Knight just says, "I move for no man." And I'm underlining here all things I think would become more or less summary. As they fight, King Arthur cuts off the Black Knight's limbs one by one. The Black Knight does not seem to feel pain or even try to stop fighting when he is obviously lost. So then, again, we go through the first half of this paragraph. More of it than not is just retelling the plot of the film. We don't need any of that, right? Eventually, we do get to some kinds of senses of what the student may be trying to do. The Black Knight does not seem to feel pain. This is very silly and unrealistic kind of violence. It always seems more about comedy than building an exciting scene. Another thing that makes the violence seem silly is the use of editing in the scene. At times, the continuity between shots breaks and weapons just seem to appear. Now, finally, at the sort of end of the paragraph, the student's getting interesting. But again, we don't know why they're bringing up these details. And what I mean to say here is that in a typical student paper, I would say that this is, in first drafts, about 75, 80, sometimes maybe even 90% of the paragraph organizations look like something like this. In other words, the students will, in chronological order, list a bunch of details from the work they're trying to analyze. And then about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way the paragraph through, they'll realize they're not really sure what it is this paragraph is trying to prove or do, so that they'll throw in a bunch of kind of difficult claims at the end that don't really connect to the details that they've listed. In other words, we know that the scene is unrealistic, but we would have known that anyway. We know that they're trying to be funny, but it's a comedy movie, so that seems kind of obvious, right? If you can answer what they're trying to satirize or what it is they're making fun of, that starts to be a more interesting paper. But more important than just that, the sort of balance of the paragraph here is completely inverted. In other words, don't start with the evidence, start with the argument you're trying to make, or start with the claim that you're trying to make at the beginning of the paragraph. So then when you bring up particular kinds of evidence, you can explain what it has to do with the claim, right? So that when you tell me, for example, the Black Knight kills the Green Knight by throwing a very large sword in the Green Knight's visor, there may be good reasons why you would bring up that detail. But until we know what they are, it's a pretty useless bit of information, right? So, chronological organization in a literary analysis, while feeling very natural, is actually generally the wrong thing to do. I think either globally in the scope of paper, you don't want to have paragraph on the beginning, a paragraph on the middle, a paragraph in the end. And even more importantly, within your paragraphs, you don't want to just go through plot details here. Again, I think this all feels really natural, but it is a mistake, right? I mean, we all are kind of natural storytellers, so chronological order makes sense. And trying to build up to a big finish at the end of the paragraph also makes sense. But more often than not, it's just confusing, and these details that you bring up initially in the paragraph tend not to mean anything or seem anything other than just summary or retelling of the story, because we don't see how they're connected to the analysis that you're actually trying to do. It means something to you, but it's not going to mean anything to your reader. So I highly recommend that you don't organize your paragraphs or your paper in this fashion. Once again, do not organize your paper chronologically. So that's what not to do. Let's think a little bit more in the next video about what you can do.